The second lesson is from the Gospel of Luke, the very familiar parable of the prodigal son. Luke writes, "Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling and saying, 'This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them.' So Jesus told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. And while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" This is the word of the Lord. Let us pray. Oh God, meet us where we are this day and open our hearts to you. Amen. The parable of the prodigal son should be called the parable of the loving father and his 2 lost sons, as I hope you will see. You know how the story goes. Father has 2 sons. The younger, rebellious son insults his father, asking for his share of the inheritance. And in first century Middle Eastern culture, this was the most egregious, dishonorable, disrespectful thing a son could do to his father. In essence, Dad, I want my share of the inheritance now so that I will be free. You cannot expect me to stay here in this two-bit community and run this farm with my older, boring brother, or take care of you when you get old and aged. Immaturity is blinding. Well, the father grants his disrespectful son this request, and then when he goes to a faraway place, maybe Corinth or Rome, perhaps with a steamy culture of singles, women, and drugs, he lives recklessly until he's broke. Meanwhile, the father waits. How long? A week, a month, a year, years? We don't know. But the son parties himself broke, and eating the slop of pigs, he realizes that at least he can go home and be a field worker in his father's house. And there he'll be treated better than he is now. Now, it's not that he misses his father, or that he misses his family, or that he wants to be reconciled. He's broke. He's hungry. And so he rehearses a speech that will get him back onto the farm. The son journeys back, and when he's still some distance away, the father, who has been waiting and whose heart has been empty with grief, sees his son approaching. Now, this is when we might expect the father to man up, right? To refuse to see his disrespectful son. To give him some lecture on being responsible. To say, at least, you made your bed, now you lie in it. Or let him in on the condition that now he can prove himself worthy. And give him a job cleaning up the stables before he lets him back into the big house. What does the father do? He runs and puts his arms around his son and he kisses him. Aristotle said, great men never run in public. Nor do respected patriarchs of the first century. It was such an unmanly thing to do, running, humiliating yourself in front of the neighbors, forgetting about saving face or your reputation, and all this manliness he was throwing away. The son starts his rehearsed speech that he's sinned, that he's unworthy, but before he can get the next sentence out, the father interrupts him. He turns to his servant and says, quickly, bring the best robe and put it on him, and rings on his finger and sandals on his feet, and kill the fatted calf. Let's eat, let's celebrate. This son of mine was dead. Now he is alive, he is lost, and now he is found. And the party begins. This was not just a family party. No, when a fatted calf was killed in a Middle Eastern community, it meant the whole village was invited to the party. Well, for Dutch artist, that classic painter, Rembrandt, his painting entitled The Return of the Prodigal Son was his last work before his death. You have it there on the front of your bulletin. And in Rejoice, you have it as an insert. If you look closely, you will see something telling about the father. You see it? He is blind. Get it? The father is blind to the fact that his son has insulted him. He is blind to the humiliation that he is being put through. He is blind to see that his son is more broke than he is repentant, that his son is playing him. Love is blind, Rembrandt believes. Or is that the message of Jesus? Rembrandt believes that God's forgiveness is the kind of blind love that we might receive from our mother or father. You know how children are always asking these great questions about God. What does God look like? I think I may show them this painting from Rembrandt. This is what God looks like with this blind love. Now, this really should be the end of the story where the celebration begins. But for whatever reason, Jesus, who tells the story, decides not to end there, and instead adds in another character, the older brother. So the story continues. The elder son was in the field, and when he came in near the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant replied, "Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf." This enrages the older brother, so much so that he refuses to go in. Then the father goes out and pleads with his son to come in. And the older brother says to him, "Listen, for all these years I've worked like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your commandment. And yet you've never given me even a young goat to celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you kill the fatted calf for him." The father says, "Son, you were always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and now found." Do you wonder why Jesus added the older brother to the story? Someone has said that the big sins generally are not all that problematic for us. One man said, "I seem to have no problem with murder or honoring my parents. I seem to able to handle the prohibitions against adultery or bearing false witness or stealing. I don't worship any graven images. But when I come to the little sins, I have flat tires and broken axles all over the place. Jealousy, greed, anger, resentment are the kind of bumps that are more likely to cause me a breakdown. Hatred, selfishness, fear, impatience are my difficulties rather than the commandments." Why does Jesus add the older brother to the story? Maybe it was because the older brother could say that he was faithful to his father and to God, and as proof he could point to the law, how he was keeping the law, especially the commandments. But when it came to his heart, the older brother was lost. Lost. Now, whether it's true or not, older brothers and older sisters believe that they have a much more difficult time than their younger siblings, right? I mean, the story sort of goes like this. Older siblings are the guinea pigs for their parents' untested parenting skills. And the older brothers and the older daughters then become the responsible ones among the children. Hearing other siblings talk about their parents, and I have an older sibling, sort of sounds like this. I received the impact of their discipline. By the time number 2 came along, my parents had learned a few things. They were more relaxed, more lenient. By the time number 3 came, just let them do whatever they want. So is it any wonder that older brothers and older sisters are a little resentful when it comes to their siblings? These youngers can be playfully irresponsible and yet always seem to come out smelling like a rose. The elder brother or sister believes their youngers get away with murder, and the parents, they just slough it off. The older brother in the parable is incensed that his irresponsible younger brother returns home to a party. So where is the tough love in that? He wants to know. Now, I imagine this younger brother as a carefree spirit with personality plus. Probably never studied a bit, but came home with all A's. Knew how to schmooze the teacher, to play up to the aunts and the uncles. The girls just loved him. He never met a stranger. But the older brother, who was the responsible one, did his homework every night. Never broke curfew, did all the chores around the house and worked long hours in the field. Parents never worried about him throwing a party when they were away for the weekend. But there are some revealing words from the older son. Listen. He doesn't call his brother his brother. Rather, he says to his father, when this son of yours comes home, not my brother. And then when he lashes out at his father, he says, listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you. Hear that? The older brother does not call his brother, and he thinks of his father as a master and he as the slave. Something is missing here. The older brother is missing the heart piece that makes relationships meaningful and joyful. Now, his relationships are driven by duty and by responsibility, and they have become infested with anger and resentment and jealousy. And yet his sin is not so outlandish, right? No prostitutes, no irresponsible and wild living, no spending all his money at the casinos. And even though his sins would not be featured on entertainment tonight, do you think maybe, just maybe, the reason Jesus adds this brother into the story is because he is just as lost as his younger brother? Maybe Jesus was thinking of most of us. Solid citizens, hardworking, industrious, doing the right thing, imperfect but responsible. I mean, we have courts and crimes for the big sins, right? But no one will ever go to jail for killing a relationship because of constant bickering or self-righteous rigidity that refuses to compromise, or because of a joyless disposition, right? It's not a criminal offense not to love your neighbor. So I am suspicious that Jesus puts this elder son into the parable because he knew that the sins of the heart, the sins of the spirit, such as anger and pride and envy and lack of compassion and self-righteousness, are the impediments for an an authentic, real, transformed spiritual life. You with me? Now, the star of the parable is the father. He says to his oldest son, you are always with me, and all that's mine is yours. So just as the father loved and welcomed the irresponsible lost son, so the father loves and welcomes the responsible lost son. The father did not love either of his children according to what they deserved. He loved them because they were his children. That's blind love. There's a fable of a wealthy young man who was born with a disfigured face, so he always stayed in, refusing to go outside. But in the evenings, he would sometimes leave his house and he would walk down by the ocean. And one night as he was walking, he heard this beautiful music. So he hid himself in the shadows, and there was a young girl who was playing a violin. So each night he began to leave his house and walk down by the water and listen to the young lady playing the music while still holding himself back in the shadows. Later, this wealthy young man instructed his servant, take the money and make sure that this young violinist goes to the finest music school in the world in order to study, which she did. And after years of study, she returned home and asked to be taken to the house of the man who had paid for her education. He was standing in his garden with his back turned, and the gate opened for her, and she came up behind him and threw her arms around him and cried, I love you, I love you. And the man with the disfigured face turned around and said, how can you love me with all this ugliness in my face? And she replied, I am blind. Love is blind. The way the Father loved his sons was blind. He loved them in spite of their flaws. The Father, of course, is God. And you and I, we are the blind, flawed, oldest, and youngest children. One last thing. The parable ends with the older son standing outside the party. We don't know whether he goes in or not. The outcome is left, unsettled. Maybe the reason Jesus left it unsettled is because he hopes the responsible ones, the ones that have such a hard time with forgiveness and grace, will come inside and experience this party of grace and somehow then become blind with love, forgiveness, and grace.